My family tortured my fiancé for 2 years. They left him in the woods without his inhaler. He almost died. Now my dad and brother boycotted my wedding because I refused to forgive them. I'm 28 years old. I work as a freelance graphic designer, and I need to tell this story because what happened with my family and my fiancé Alexander almost completely destroyed our relationship. And even today, months after the wedding, things are still a mess. I guess I should start from the beginning, when Alexander met my family like 2 years ago. I knew my dad and my uncles were, let's say, intense about testing people. You know, they've always had this weird thing where the men in the family have to prove they're worthy or whatever. But honestly, I thought with Alexander, it would be different, because he's literally the calmest, kindest, and most intelligent person I know. He's 30, works in finance, super patient, and I was convinced my family would love him right away. The first time I took him to my parents' house for a family dinner, everything seemed to be going well at first. My mom was delighted with him. They talked about cooking because Alexander likes to cook, and I was thinking, perfect, this is going great. But then, after dinner, my dad says, "Well, Alexander, I hope you play chess." And Alexander, being super polite, said yes. He played a little. And that's when it all started. My dad took him to the living room where he had his chessboard and they played a game. Alexander won. And I saw my dad's face. That expression he made when someone challenged him unintentionally. Then my dad said, "Another game," and they played again. Alexander won again. And my dad insisted on a third, then a fourth, until it was 4 consecutive games, and Alexander won all 4. I was like, okay, this is a bit awkward, but at least Alexander proved he's smart, right? But my dad didn't say anything positive, just got up and said, "Interesting," with that voice he used when he wasn't happy. After that night, I thought that was it, that the test was over, but I had no idea what was coming. Like 2 weeks later, Alexander and I went to a family gathering at my uncle's house. We were there all afternoon, and when we were about to leave, Alexander noticed that one of his car tires was completely flat. I thought it was bad luck, maybe it was a nail or something, but when Alexander checked more closely, he saw that someone had deliberately slashed it. And I was like, what the hell? Because we were at my uncle's house, in a super safe neighborhood. It didn't make sense. Alexander was super calm, called a tow truck. We waited like an hour. And while we were waiting, my cousin came over with this weird smile and said, "Well, at least you handled the situation well, bro." And that's when it clicked. I asked my cousin directly if he had slashed the tire, and he just shrugged and said, it was just a test to see how he reacted under pressure. I got so angry. I yelled at him that that wasn't a test. It was vandalism. But he just laughed and said I was overreacting. Things kept escalating in ways I couldn't believe. My family, especially my dad, my uncle and my cousin, started mocking Alexander's asthma. Yes, Alexander has asthma. It's not severe, but he needs his inhaler from time to time, especially if he does intense exercise or is in environments with lots of dust or pollen. And my family, instead of being understanding, acted like it was an unforgivable weakness. My dad would make comments like, "A real man doesn't need an inhaler," or my cousin would say things like, "What are you going to do if there's an emergency and you can't breathe? Call your mommy?" I tried to defend him, told them to stop being idiots, but they just said it was a joke, that Alexander needed to learn not to take things so seriously. But I could see Alexander's face, see how he clenched his jaw and just nodded, trying to keep his composure. And it hurt me to see my family treat him like that. Then came the fishing and hunting trip. My dad organized this weekend where supposedly they were going to do male bonding, go to the lake, fish, camp, all that stuff. Alexander isn't exactly the type of person who goes hunting. Truth is, he's more into reading books and cooking gourmet dishes, but he agreed to go because he wanted to get along with my family. I didn't go. Obviously, because according to my dad, it was a man thing. Alexander told me later that the whole trip was basically an interrogation. My dad, my uncle, and my cousin asked him super weird hypothetical questions like, if you were on a desert island and could only save one person, would you save my daughter or your mom? Or things like, if you had to fight a bear to protect the family, would you do it? And Alexander tried to answer with logic, saying things like, well, I'd probably call the authorities instead of fighting a bear because that would be suicide. And they'd mock him and say he was a coward. They also made fun of his way of fishing, how he held the rod. Literally everything. Alexander told me he felt like he was on a horrible reality show where everyone was against him. But the worst, the absolutely worst, came later. Like a month before the wedding, my dad organized another camping trip. This time longer, like 3 days in the mountains. And me, being an idiot, thought maybe this time it would be different, that maybe my family would finally accept Alexander. He went, took his backpack, his inhaler, everything. The first 2 days were weird but manageable according to what he told me by text. But on the third day, Alexander stopped responding. I started to worry. I called my dad and he just said everything was fine, that they were without signal. But Alexander came home that same day, like at 6 inches the evening, and I had never seen him so upset. He was pale, sweating, and shaking. He told me that my dad, my uncle, and my cousin had hidden his inhaler while he was sleeping, and then they had left him alone in the forest, literally abandoned him, telling him it was a survival test and that he had to find his way back to the camp on his own. Alexander has asthma, remember? And they hid his inhaler in the middle of the forest where there was tons of pollen and dust. Alexander told me he walked for hours, that his breathing kept getting worse, that he felt his lungs closing up, and that at one point he thought he was literally going to die there. He found a road by pure luck, stopped a car, and the driver took him back to civilization. When he got home and told me everything, I exploded. I called my dad immediately, yelling at him that they had endangered Alexander's life, that this wasn't a test, it was basically attempted murder. And my dad, instead of apologizing, laughed and said I was being dramatic, that Alexander was fine, that it was just a game, that real men know how to survive in nature without needing an inhaler as a crutch. I told him he was completely crazy, that what they did was criminal, but he just said Alexander needed to have more of a sense of humor. At that moment, Alexander looked at me and said, "I'm done with your family. I'm not going to be around them again." And honestly, I didn't blame him at all. The following days were horrible. Alexander was traumatized, wasn't sleeping well, had nightmares about being trapped in the forest, unable to breathe. I felt devastated because my family had done this. My own family almost killed the person I love because of a stupid, toxic tradition. I tried to talk to my mom, thinking she would be the voice of reason. But although she admitted things had gone too far, she also said I should try to understand that my dad just wanted to make sure Alexander was strong enough to take care of me. I told her that was complete nonsense, that Alexander took care of me perfectly fine without needing to survive in the forest like we were on some extreme survival reality show. Then my brother came to visit me. I thought maybe he would support me, but no, he was completely on my dad's side. He told me I was overreacting, that Alexander needed to learn to be a man, that our family was just following tradition, and that if I couldn't accept that, then it was my problem. I yelled at him that tradition doesn't justify endangering someone's life, and he accused me of being too sensitive and of destroying the family over a man I'd barely known for 2 years. That hurt me so much, because my brother and I had always been close, and seeing him defend something so obviously toxic was devastating. I had to make a decision. I called my dad and told him that if he and the rest of the family didn't genuinely apologize to Alexander and promise to stop doing these ridiculous tests, I would cut all contact with them, including not inviting them to the wedding. My dad laughed at first, thinking I was bluffing, but I told him very seriously that I was completely serious, that Alexander was my future husband, and that if I had to choose between my toxic family and him, I would choose Alexander without hesitation. There was a long silence on the phone, and finally, my dad said, "Okay, we'll talk." We organized a family dinner like a week later at a neutral restaurant because Alexander flatly refused to go to my parents' house. That dinner was one of the most awkward things I've experienced. My dad arrived with my mom, my brother, my uncle, and my cousin. Alexander was next to me, super tense, and I had his hand squeezed tight under the table. My dad started by saying that, well, maybe they had gone a bit overboard with the jokes, but that it had all been in good faith. I told him that wasn't an apology, that he needed to genuinely apologize and acknowledge that what they did was dangerous and wrong. My dad made a face, clearly annoyed at having to do it, and finally mumbled something like, "I'm sorry if we made you feel bad." Alexander. I was going to say that wasn't enough either, but Alexander squeezed my hand and said it was okay, that he accepted the apology but needed them to promise not to do something like that again. My dad nodded, but I could see, in his eyes, that he wasn't really sorry. He was just saying what I wanted to hear to keep the peace. I thought that would calm everything down. But like 2 weeks later, my cousin contacted me, asked me to meet him at a cafe. I went thinking maybe he wanted to really apologize, but instead he gave me a whole speech about how I was destroying the family, that my dad was devastated because I was choosing Alexander over them, that family should always come first, and that if I continued with this attitude, I was going to regret it. I told him that what I would regret was allowing my family to abuse my future husband, and that if they couldn't treat him with basic respect, then maybe it was better to keep distance. My cousin got angry, said I had changed, that Alexander had brainwashed me, and left the cafe, leaving me there with the bill. We organized a second family dinner closer to the wedding, like 3 weeks before the event. This time it was at my parents' house because Alexander, being the saint he is, said he was willing to try again if it made me feel better. I told him he didn't have to, that I was willing to cut contact with my family if necessary, but he insisted. That dinner was super forced, everyone being polite in a super artificial way, my dad asking Alexander about his work but in a tone that didn't sound genuinely interested, more like he was checking off a checklist. My mom tried to make light conversation, my brother barely spoke, and my uncle and cousin were sitting there with faces like they didn't want to be there. At the end of dinner, my dad said they promised to behave at the wedding and respect Alexander, but again, I could feel they were empty words, that they were saying it because they had no other choice if they wanted to be in my life. And then the wedding day arrived. I was nervous, but also excited. I had dreamed of this day since I was a little girl. The ceremony was at 4 inches the afternoon, and around 2 I received a message from my brother saying that he and my dad weren't going to be able to come because they felt conflicted about the whole situation, that they felt I had put them in an impossible position by forcing them to apologize and change their behavior, and that they couldn't in good conscience celebrate a wedding where they felt they weren't really welcome. I froze reading that message. My mom, my uncle, and my cousin did show up, but seeing the empty chairs where my dad and brother should have been was devastating. I cried before walking down the aisle, ruined my makeup, and my mom had to fix it quickly. During the whole ceremony, I tried to focus on Alexander, on how he looked at me with so much love, but I couldn't stop thinking that my dad and brother had chosen their pride over being at one of the most important days of my life. After the wedding, my mom tried to mediate. She told me my dad was very hurt because he felt I had made him look like the villain in front of the whole extended family when, in reality, he was just following family traditions. I told her his traditions were abusive, and that if he couldn't see that, then maybe it was better he wasn't in my life. My mom started crying, saying I was tearing the family apart, but I told her it wasn't me tearing it apart, it was my dad, with his refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. The months after the wedding were weird. My mom visited me sometimes, but always tried to convince me to reconcile with my dad. My uncle and cousin stopped talking to me completely. My brother sent me a message on my birthday, but it was super cold, like happy birthday, nothing more. And my dad started telling the whole extended family that I had kicked him out of my life for no reason, that he had been a perfect father and that I was ungrateful. Cousins I didn't even see often sent me messages saying I should forgive my dad, that family is the most important thing, and I had to block several of them because I couldn't deal with that constant pressure. Alexander and I established very clear boundaries. We told my mom she was welcome in our home as long as she didn't try to pressure us to reconcile with my dad. We told her that my dad and brother could be part of our lives again when they showed with actions, not just words, that they respected Alexander and understood that what they did was wrong. My mom wasn't happy with that but accepted it. And my uncle sent me a message like 4 months later, saying that maybe they had exaggerated a bit, but that I had also overreacted. And I simply didn't respond, because I wasn't going to get into that circular discussion again. Now, like 6 months after the wedding, things are stable, but sad. Alexander and I are fine. Our relationship is strong. He supports me in everything, and I support him. But there's this part of me that hurts when I think about my family. When I see old photos of when I was a kid and my dad carried me on his shoulders, or when I remember how my brother and I used to play video games until dawn. I miss how things were before, but I also know I can't go back to that. I can't sacrifice my relationship with Alexander just to maintain a facade of happy family, when in reality the dynamic was super toxic. My therapist tells me I did the right thing, that setting boundaries is healthy, but that doesn't make it hurt less. Last week, my mom asked me if Alexander and I were considering having children soon, and I told her, yes, probably in a couple of years. She got sad and said, "Your dad would have been an incredible grandfather." And I had to tell her, if Dad wants to be part of his future grandchildren's lives, he's going to have to show he can respect his son-in-law first. She just nodded and changed the subject. I don't know if my dad will ever really understand what he did, if he'll ever be able to put his pride aside and really apologize. But in the meantime, I have to protect my marriage and my peace of mind, even if that means keeping distance from the family I thought would always be there for me.